Hello there, weary traveler. Have you ever wondered what it was really like to wake up knowing that your reputation made you a walking target? Welcome to this journey through the forgotten realities of the American frontier. Before we begin, I'd love to know where in the world you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. Feel free to leave a comment and let me know. If you enjoy this style of immersive tales that reveal the human truth behind the legends, go ahead and click that subscribe button so you don't miss future adventures. Tonight we're going to discover something that will completely change how you see the mythology of the Old West. Let's allow the stresses of the modern world to melt away as we travel back to a time when survival meant more than just drawing. First, it meant living with psychological burdens that would break most people today. So imagine yourself stepping off a dusty stagecoach in 1875, your boots hitting the parched earth of a frontier town somewhere in the vast expanse of the American West. The first thing that strikes you is the heat. It radiates up from the ground, in shimmering waves, creating mirages that dance on the horizon. The wooden buildings around you creak and groan under the relentless sun, their paint long since peeled away by wind and weather. The main street is nothing more than packed dirt, marked by the deep ruts of countless wagon wheels and scarred by the hoofprints of horses that have long since moved on. This is the Old West that most of us never see in the movies. Not the romanticized version of noble cowboys and clear-cut heroes, but the real frontier, where survival meant making hard choices every single day, where the line between law and lawlessness wasn't drawn by badges or courtrooms, but by whoever could draw their gun fastest and shoot straightest. Now let's step deeper into this harsh reality. Picture the scene more clearly now. You're standing in front of what might generously be called the town's main saloon, though it's little more than four walls and a roof with a few tables inside. Through the batwing doors, you can hear the low murmur of conversation, the clink of glasses, and the occasional burst of laughter that sounds more desperate than joyful. The air is thick with dust, and the scent of unwashed bodies, leather, and something else you can't quite identify, something that speaks to the hardness of life out here. To your left, you notice a man leaning against a hitching post. His clothes are worn and faded, his hat pulled low over his eyes. There's something about the way he carries himself, the way his right hand rests casually near the revolver on his hip, that tells you this is someone you don't want to cross. This is one of them, a gunfighter. A man who has made violence his profession in a world where violence was often the only currency that mattered. But who were these men really? What drove them to pick up a gun and make it their calling card in a world that was already dangerous enough? To understand the gunfighters of the Old West, we need to first understand the world that created them. Picture it like this. Imagine if your entire neighborhood suddenly lost all police, all courts, all government overnight. Now imagine that same neighborhood is filled with desperate men carrying life-changing amounts of money, and the only rule is, whoever draws fastest makes the rules. That was the American frontier. The American West of the 1870s and 1880s was a land of opportunity, but it was also a land of desperation. Picture this. Thousands of young veterans who had survived battles like Gettysburg and Antietam, men who had seen entire regiments wiped out in a single afternoon, suddenly found themselves in a world at peace. But peace didn't pay the bills. These men possessed one terrible, marketable skill: the ability to remain calm while other men tried to kill them. And in the lawless frontier, that skill was worth its weight in gold. Westward expansion was in full swing. The Transcontinental Railroad had been completed in 1869, opening up vast territories that had previously been accessible only to the hardiest of pioneers. Gold rushes in Colorado, California, and the Dakotas drew desperate men from across the country, all chasing the dream of striking it rich. Cattle drives moved millions of head of livestock from Texas to the railheads in Kansas, creating boom towns that sprung up overnight and sometimes disappeared just as quickly. But with opportunity came chaos. These frontier settlements existed in a legal vacuum. Federal law was a distant concept, enforced by a handful of marshals who might cover territories the size of entire eastern states. Local law enforcement, when it existed at all, was often corrupt, incompetent, or simply outnumbered by the criminal element that thrived in these lawless environments. Into this power vacuum stepped men who had learned that violence could be a tool, a profession, and sometimes a necessity for survival. Think of them as the mercenaries of the American frontier, professionals who sold their deadly skills to the highest bidder. Some wore badges and called themselves lawmen, others openly embraced the outlaw life. But many existed in that dangerous, grey area between the two. Hired guns who worked for whoever could pay their price, whether that was a cattle baron, a mining company, or a desperate town council. What made this situation even more volatile were the massive economic stakes at play. The economic forces driving westward expansion created a perfect storm for violence. The cattle industry alone was worth millions of dollars, with individual herds representing fortunes that men would kill for. Range wars erupted between cattle barons and homesteaders, between different ranching operations, between anyone who had something to gain and was willing to fight for it. In these conflicts, skilled gunmen weren't just useful, they were essential. Consider the sheer scope of the territory we're talking about. In 1870, the population density of most Western territories was less than 2 people per square mile. Compare that to the eastern states, where population densities were often 50 times higher. This meant that for every square mile of eastern farmland, with its churches, schools, and established communities, the West had 50 square miles of empty land where a man could disappear forever, where justice was whatever you could enforce with your own hands. The mining camps were particularly volatile. Gold and silver strikes would create instant cities of 10,000 people or more, filled with miners, merchants, gamblers, and prostitutes, all trying to extract wealth from each other in whatever way they could. These camps had no established social order, no traditional authorities, no way to resolve disputes except through force. A man with a fast draw and steady nerves could find steady work as a bodyguard, an enforcer, or simply as someone who provided a sense of security in an utterly insecure world. But it wasn't just the promise of easy money that created gunfighters. The psychological trauma of the Civil War cannot be understated. Hundreds of thousands of men had experienced combat in ways that previous generations of Americans never had. They had seen friends die in agony, had killed men face to face, had survived battles where the casualties numbered in the tens of thousands. Many of these veterans suffered from what we would now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder, though such terms didn't exist then. For these men, the violence of frontier life might have seemed almost normal. The skills they had learned in war, the ability to remain calm under fire, to make split-second decisions that meant the difference. Between life and death, these were exactly the skills that could make a man successful as a gunfighter. Some historians argue that the gunfighter culture of the Old West was essentially a continuation of the Civil War by other means. The technology of the time also played a crucial role in the rise of the gunfighter. The development of reliable, mass-produced revolvers, particularly the Colt Peacemaker introduced in 1873, democratized violence in a way that had never been possible before. A skilled gunman with a good revolver could face down multiple opponents. The 6-shot capacity meant that a single man could control a situation in ways that would have been impossible with single-shot weapons. The railroad network that was spreading across the West also contributed to the gunfighter phenomenon. It allowed news to travel faster, creating the first truly national celebrities in American history. Stories of famous gunfights would be reported in newspapers from coast to coast, sometimes within days of the events. This media attention created a feedback loop where skilled gunmen became famous, and fame brought both opportunities and challenges. Men like Wild Bill Hickok found themselves trapped by their own reputations. Every young hotshot with a gun wanted to be the man who killed the famous Wild Bill. Fame meant money and respect, but it also meant constantly looking over your shoulder, knowing that your reputation made you a target for anyone looking to make a name for themselves. The cattle drives that were such a defining feature of the Old West also created a demand for men who could handle violence. A typical cattle drive might involve moving 2,000 head of cattle over 1,000 miles with a crew of just 10 to 15 cowboys. These drives passed through territories claimed by various Indian tribes, through lands disputed by different ranching operations, through areas controlled by outlaws who saw the herds as easy targets. The trail bosses who organized these drives needed men who could not only handle cattle, but could also handle themselves in a fight. They needed riders who wouldn't panic when faced with a Comanche war party, who could stand their ground when confronted by rustlers, who could maintain discipline among a crew of rough men living in harsh conditions for months at a time. But behind all this economic and political context lived real human beings facing an unimaginable psychological burden. What was daily life actually like for these men? What did it mean to wake up each morning knowing that your survival might depend on how fast you could draw your gun? Imagine waking up every single day knowing that somewhere out there, someone is planning to kill you specifically. Not because you've wronged them, but because killing you would make them famous. That psychological burden would crush most people, but these men carried it like a second skin. Most gunfighters lived hand to mouth, moving from town to town, taking whatever work they could find. Some worked as town marshals, trying to maintain order in communities that were often more lawless than the surrounding wilderness. Others hired themselves out to cattle barons or mining companies, serving as private enforcers in economic disputes. Many supplemented their income through gambling, which was often as dangerous as gunfighting itself. The towns where these men lived and worked were unlike anything in the settled East. Dodge City, Tombstone, Deadwood, Abilene, these names evoke images of the wild frontier, but imagine stepping off a stagecoach into what was essentially a military camp disguised as a town. Buildings threw together so hastily that you could see daylight through the walls. Streets that transformed from ankle-deep mud in spring to choking dust clouds in summer. And everywhere, the sweet, sickly smell of death, from animals, from disease, from the violence that erupted as regularly as thunderstorms. In such an environment, a man's reputation was everything. Word traveled fast in the small world of the frontier. The gunfighter's persona becomes a product of risk and restraint. A gunfighter who backed down from a challenge would find it hard to get work, but one who was too quick to fight might find himself facing a murder charge in one of the few jurisdictions that still functioned. The successful gunfighters were those who could walk the fine line between being feared and being hunted. But what was it really like to wake up as one of these men? Let's step into their boots. The first pale fingers of dawn crept across the endless frontier, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. I'm still here with you, wrapped in this story of survival, and as the morning mist began to lift from the valley below our gunfighters' camp, something profound was about to unfold. The crisp morning air carried the scent of wood smoke and dew-dampened earth, and in the distance, a meadowlark's call pierced the silence like a silver note against the vast canvas of the awakening wilderness. Picture this scene with me. Our gunfighter stirs in his bedroll as the first light touches his weathered face. There's no alarm clock out here, no gentle wake-up call from civilization. Instead, it's the subtle shift in temperature, the change in the quality of darkness and years of living on the edge that pulls him from sleep. His hand instinctively moves to the Colt at his side before his eyes even open. This isn't paranoia, it's survival refined to an art form. The campfire from the night before has burned down to glowing embers, small orange eyes winking in the ash. But here's where the magic of frontier life begins to reveal itself. Watch as he moves with practiced efficiency. Every gesture honed by countless mornings exactly like this one. He coaxes those dying embers back to life with dry tinder, and his breath, each small flame a victory against the cold indifference of the wild. The coffee comes next, and friends, this isn't your modern morning ritual. This is thick, bitter chicory. Coffee brewed in a battered tin pot, the kind that could wake the dead and probably had to on more than one occasion. The grounds float on top like dark islands, and the first sip burns all the way down, but it's liquid courage in a cup. Steam rises from the metal rim, curling in the cool morning air like small prayers, ascending to whatever gods watch over those who live by the gun. While the coffee works its harsh magic, our gunfighter begins the most sacred ritual of his dangerous trade, the morning inspection of his weapons. And this, my friends, is where boring becomes beautiful, where the mundane transforms into meditation. He draws his Colt peacemaker with the reverence of a priest handling sacred relics. The metal is cold to the touch, its weight familiar as his own heartbeat. Every chamber must be checked, every cartridge examined for moisture, for damage, for the 1,000 small failures that could mean the difference between breathing and bleeding out in the dust. He rotates the cylinder slowly, the mechanical clicks as precise and rhythmic as a metronome keeping time with death itself. The brass casings catch the early morning light, each one a promise or perhaps a threat, waiting to be fulfilled. The brass casings catch the early morning light, each one a promise or perhaps a threat waiting to be fulfilled. The metal is cold to the touch, its weight familiar as his own heartbeat. The cleaning comes next, and here's where time seems to slow down, where the outside world fades away until there's nothing but man, metal, and the methodical rhythm of maintenance. A small piece of cloth, dampened with gun oil that smells of industry and intention. He runs it through the barrel with a cleaning rod, each stroke deliberate, almost loving. The cloth emerges darkened with powder residue and the accumulated grime of hard use. But it's not just about the gun, you see. It's about the mind, the spirit, the preparation for a day that might demand everything and give nothing in return. As he works, cleaning each component with the patience of a craftsman and the urgency of a man who knows his life depends on perfection, he's also cleaning his thoughts, organizing his mental landscape for whatever chaos the day might bring. The leather holster receives the same attention. Every stitch examined, every crease oiled and worked supple. A holster that binds at the wrong moment, a drawer that catches on worn leather. These aren't just inconveniences out here. They're death sentences written in fractions of seconds. He practices the drawer, not fast and showy, like the dime novels would have you believe, but smooth and deliberate. The gun clears leather with a whisper, rises to eye level with mechanical precision. One motion, fluid as water, deadly as lightning. The morning ritual extends beyond weapons. His boots need attention-dried blood from yesterday's encounter with a wounded animal, dust from endless miles of hard travel, tears in the leather that could let in scorpions or rattlesnakes. He works saddle soap into the leather with his fingers, feeling for weak spots, checking the stitching that holds these barriers between his feet and a hostile world. His hat, that broad-brimmed companion that shielded him from sun and rain and flying lead, gets reshaped and brushed. The band is stained with salt from sweat and fear, the crown punctured by a bullet from a gunfight 3 towns back. He runs, his fingers around the brim, checking for damage, adjusting the angle. A hat out here isn't fashion, it's armor against a sun that can kill as surely as any bullet. As the morning progresses and the sun climbs higher, painting the landscape in harsh, unforgiving light, our gunfighter moves through these routines with the quiet intensity of a monk at prayer. Because that's what this is, really, a form of prayer, a communion with the tools and techniques that keep death at arm's length for one more day. Beyond personal preparation, survival demanded caring for the companions that could mean the difference between life and death. The horses need attention, too, of course. He checks their hooves for stones, their legs for cuts or swelling, their eyes for signs of illness. Out here, a lame horse is a death sentence, just as surely as an empty gun. He runs his hands over their flanks, feeling for heat, for tenderness, for the subtle signs that might spell disaster miles from help. The grain is measured carefully, too. Much and they'll founder, too little and they'll lack the strength for a hard ride. Water is checked and rechecked, canteens filled from the small stream that runs clear and cold through this hidden valley. He tastes it first, checking for the mineral tang that might signal alkali, for the sweetness that could mean contamination upstream. Clean water is life itself in a land that hoards moisture like a miser hoards gold. The sun is fully up now, burning away the last of the morning mist, and our gunfighter stands in the growing heat, surveying his small domain. Every tool checked, every weapon ready, every precaution taken that experience and hard-won wisdom can provide. But in the growing intensity of the light, in the way shadows are already beginning to shorten toward noon, there's a reminder of what's coming. This peaceful morning, this interlude of routine and preparation, is just that, an interlude. Because, as sure as the sun rises, as certain as the day follows night, there are challenges waiting out there in the harsh brightness of the frontier day. Men with faster guns, animals with sharper claws, a landscape that kills the unprepared with casual indifference. The bedroll is tied tight against moisture, the cooking gear cleaned and packed where it won't rattle and give away his position to unfriendly ears. And as he swings into the saddle, feeling his horse's muscles bunch beneath him, ready for another day of hard travel and harder choices, there's something almost beautiful about this moment of transition. From the peaceful rituals of morning into the brutal uncertainties of day, from preparation into action, from the known into the unknown. As the morning mist clears completely, revealing the harsh realities of frontier survival stretching endlessly ahead, our gunfighter urges his horse forward into whatever the day might bring, armed not just with weapons and supplies, but with the quiet confidence that comes from thorough preparation and the hard-earned wisdom of those who survive by their wits and their will. But what drove these men to choose such a deadly profession in the first place? To understand that, we need to follow the money. I'm Thomas, a frontier economics researcher, and I've spent years studying the forgotten financial realities of the American frontier. What most people don't realize is that behind every legendary gunfighter's reputation was a brutal economic truth. These men weren't romantic heroes. They were desperate entrepreneurs in the world's deadliest business. Picture this scene. It's dawn in Dodge City, 1878. The air is crisp with the smell of wood smoke and horse leather. A man walks down Front Street, his boots echoing on the wooden boardwalk. His name is John Wesley Hardin, and he's not walking toward glory or adventure. He's walking toward his next meal, because when you live by the gun in the Old West, every day is a question of survival economics. The brutal truth is that most gunfighters weren't living some romantic dream. They were desperate men, trapped in a cycle of violence that started with something as simple as needing money to eat. Picture Wild Bill Hickok before he became a legend. A broke veteran walking from town to town with holes in his boots, his stomach gnawing with hunger, willing to risk his life for enough money to buy a meal. That desperation, that crushing need to survive another day, was the real driving force behind the gun. I've dug deep into the historical records, and what I found was astonishing. The average cowboy in the 1870s made about $25 a month. That's roughly $600 in today's money for a month of backbreaking work. But here's the kicker. Most of that money was gone before they even left town. Room, board, supplies, and yes, entertainment consumed their wages, faster than a wildfire consumes dry grass. The answer tells us everything about why the frontier produced so many men willing to kill for money. Let me tell you about Clay Allison, a man whose story perfectly captures this economic desperation. Born in Tennessee, he came west after the Civil War with nothing but the clothes on his back and a natural talent for violence. The historical records show he tried his hand at legitimate work first, ranching, farming, even working as a ranch hand for other men. But the pay was inconsistent, the work was brutal, and the economic opportunities were limited to those who already had money or connections. When winter hit and Allison found himself facing starvation, he made the calculation that changed his life forever. He could work 16 hours a day for months to earn what he could make in one afternoon by hiring out his gun. The mathematics of survival forced his hand, just like it forced the hands of hundreds of other men across the frontier. Imagine being in that position. Picture the gnawing hunger, the shame of being unable to provide for yourself, the constant worry about where your next meal would come from. Now imagine someone offers you more money than you could make in 3 months of honest labor, all for one day's work with a gun. The choice seems obvious when your stomach is empty and winter is coming. But here's what makes this story even more incredible. The economy of gunfighting wasn't just about individual desperation. Entire communities were built around this system. Towns like Deadwood, Tombstone, and Dodge City functioned as economic engines that required violence to operate smoothly. Saloon owners, gamblers, cattle barons, and mine owners all needed men who could settle disputes quickly and permanently. I found records showing that a skilled gunfighter could command anywhere from $50 to $500 for a single job. Compare that to the cowboy's $25 a month, and you begin to understand the economic forces at work. Ben Thompson, one of the most feared gunmen of his era, made more money in a single afternoon in Austin than most men made in a year of honest labor. The most shocking part of this economic system was how organized it became. In some frontier towns, there were unofficial networks of men who specialized in different types of violent work. Some handled debt collection, others dealt with claim jumpers, and still others specialized in what we might call corporate enforcement for the cattle and mining interests. Take John King Fisher, a man who built an entire business model around frontier violence. He didn't just hire out his gun randomly. He created what was essentially a private army that controlled cattle rustling and smuggling operations along the Mexican border. His organization generated thousands of dollars in revenue, turning violence into a systematic business enterprise. But the economic pressures that created these men also trapped them in cycles they couldn't escape. Once you developed a reputation as a gunfighter, you became unemployable in normal society. Imagine trying to get a job as a shopkeeper when everyone knows you've killed 12 men. Picture applying to work at a bank when your reputation makes customers cross the street to avoid you. Your gun skills became both your greatest asset and your eternal prison. The very thing that helped you survive guaranteed you'd never escape the life that was slowly destroying you. This created what historians call the gunfighter's paradox. The very skills that allowed these men to survive economically also guaranteed they would never be able to integrate back into normal society. Every job they took with their guns made them more unemployable in legitimate trades. It was a trap with no escape route except death or exile. Consider the case of John Wesley Hardin, who I mentioned earlier. By the time he was 25, he had killed more than 20 men and earned enough money to buy land and start a legitimate business. But his reputation preceded him everywhere he went. Communities didn't want him, law enforcement hunted him, and his only option was to keep moving and keep fighting. The economic records from frontier towns paint a clear picture of this system in action. In Abilene, Kansas, during the cattle drive season, the amount of money changing hands through gambling, prostitution, and violence-related activities was staggering. The town's entire economy was built around vice, and the men with guns who controlled it. What's truly mind-blowing is how this economic system shaped the entire culture of the American frontier. The legendary Code of the West, the idea of settling disputes with guns instead of courts, the notion that a man's word was his bond, all of these cultural elements were really economic adaptations to a world where traditional legal and financial institutions simply didn't exist. But money wasn't the only cost of living by the gun. The social price was perhaps even higher, and it's this psychological toll that really reveals the human tragedy behind the legend of the American gunfighter. Yet money was only part of the story. The harsh economic reality of gunfighter life was just the beginning. The constant need to earn money through violence created something far more insidious. Imagine living in a psychological prison where every stranger's glance could be your death sentence. This mental torture lasted 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, until their very last breath. Picture this scene. John Wesley Hardin, one of the most feared gunfighters in Texas history, sitting alone in a dimly lit saloon at 3 in the morning. His back is pressed against the wall like a cornered animal, eyes scanning every shadow, every movement, every face that might belong to his killer. The whiskey in his glass trembles slightly, not from fear, but from hands that haven't stopped, shaking in months. This is what constant readiness to kill or be killed does to a human nervous system. It turns you into a living weapon that can never be put down. I'm fascinated by what we'd recognize today as severe post-traumatic stress, but in the 1870s, they just called it being jumpy. These men developed psychological patterns that would be absolutely mind-blowing to witness firsthand. Take Wild. Bill Hickok, the legendary lawman and gunfighter, who became so paranoid about being shot in the back that he would only sit with his back to a wall. He'd enter establishments sideways, scanning the room like a predator, his hand never straying far from his Colt Navy revolver. The isolation was the most devastating part. Picture walking through a town where your very presence empties the streets. Mothers grab their children and disappear into doorways. Shopkeepers serve you with trembling hands, desperate for you to leave. You've become a human plague, feared, avoided, completely alone, even in crowded rooms. Doc Holliday, the tubercular dentist turned gambler and gunfighter, captured this perfectly in his diary when he wrote about the crushing weight of solitude. Imagine carrying the loneliness of an entire cemetery, but still being alive enough to feel every ounce of it. But here's the kicker. They couldn't simply retire from this life. Once you had a reputation, it followed you like a shadow. Clay Allison, a notorious gunfighter from New Mexico, tried repeatedly to settle down and lead a normal life. He'd find a quiet town, maybe start courting a local woman, attempt to integrate into the community. But within weeks, word would spread. Clay Allison's in town. Young guns looking to make their reputation would start showing up, forcing him back into the very lifestyle he was desperately trying to escape. The sleep patterns of these men were absolutely incredible to study. Most gunfighters developed what we'd now recognize as severe insomnia. They'd sleep in shifts, maybe 40 minutes here, an hour there, always with one ear open for the creak of a floorboard or the jingle of spurs outside their door. Ben Thompson, a famous gunfighter and gambler, rigged elaborate alarm systems in his hotel rooms, strings tied to cans that would rattle if someone opened his door or window. He slept fully clothed with his boots on, gun within arm's reach. The really shocking part is how this constant vigilance affected their social interactions. These men became masters of reading micro-expressions, body language, the subtle shift in a room's atmosphere when danger was near. But this hyper-awareness made normal conversation almost impossible. How do you make small talk about the weather when you're simultaneously calculating the distance to every exit and cataloging every person's potential as a threat? Some developed elaborate rituals to cope with the stress. Wyatt Earp would walk the perimeter of any building he was staying in, counting his steps, memorizing potential escape routes. He'd test every chair before sitting, making sure it could support his quick movement if needed. These weren't signs of cowardice. They were survival mechanisms developed by men living on the knife's edge of death every single day. The paranoia extended to their eating habits too. Many gunfighters would only eat at certain establishments where they trusted the cook, fearing poison. They'd watch their food being prepared, sample it tentatively, and never finish a meal without checking their surroundings multiple times. Dallas Staudenmeier, the El Paso marshal, carried a special silver flask because he believed silver would detect poison, a folk belief that shows how deeply the fear had penetrated his daily life. What's truly heartbreaking is how this isolation created a self-perpetuating cycle. The more paranoid they became, the more they pushed people away. The more people feared them, the more isolated they felt. The more isolated they felt, the more they relied on violence as their primary means of communication with the world. It's a psychological trap that was virtually impossible to escape. The most devastating aspect was how it affected their attempts at love and family. Several gunfighters tried to marry and settle down, but their psychological damage made normal relationships incredibly difficult. Their wives lived in constant fear, not just of their husband being killed, but of being targeted by enemies seeking revenge. Children grew up knowing their father was a marked man, never knowing if he'd come home from a simple trip to town. King Fisher, a notorious Texas gunfighter, actually managed to marry and have children. But he described in letters to his brother the agony of watching his young son flinch every time Fisher entered a room too quickly. The boy had learned to associate sudden movements with violence, a tragic inheritance from his father's dangerous profession. Fisher wrote about lying awake at night, wondering if his presence in his family's life was protecting them or putting them in mortal danger. The alcohol consumption among gunfighters was staggering, and it wasn't just about Dutch courage before a fight. It was self-medication for what we now understand as severe anxiety and depression. They drank to numb the constant fear, to silence the voices in their heads that whispered about all the ways they might die tomorrow. But alcohol also made them unpredictable, more prone to violence, which only worsened their reputation and isolation. Some tried to find solace in religion, but even that became complicated by their violent past. How do you sit in a church pew when you've killed 12 men? How do you pray for forgiveness while wearing guns to the service? Several gunfighters describe the internal conflict between their desperate desire for redemption and their practical need to stay armed and dangerous. The truly incredible part is that despite all this psychological torture, many of these men possessed an almost supernatural ability to remain calm under extreme pressure. When the actual moment of violence arrived, the showdown in the street, the barroom brawl, the ambush, they could channel all that paranoid energy into deadly focus. It's as if all that constant anxiety had trained them to perform when it mattered most. But the cost was everything else that makes life worth living. Normal friendships, peaceful sleep, the simple pleasure of walking down a street without calculating threats. These became impossible luxuries. They'd traded their humanity for their reputation, their peace of mind for their survival. And the most tragic part is that most of them knew exactly what they'd lost, but felt powerless to get it back. Yet despite this crushing psychological isolation, some gunfighters tried desperately to maintain human connections, to find some fragment of normalcy in their violent world. The human heart, it seems, refuses to surrender even in the most impossible circumstances. The isolation of a gunfighter's life wasn't just about loneliness. It was about the desperate human need for connection in a world that made love seem impossible. Picture this: a man who could draw faster than lightning, whose reputation preceded him into every saloon, every town, every chance encounter. Now imagine that same man trying to court a woman, trying to build something tender and lasting when his very presence brought danger to everyone he cared about. I'm fascinated by the stories of these men who tried to love and be loved, because they reveal the most human side of figures we've mythologized into something almost superhuman. The truth is, many gunfighters craved the very thing their lifestyle made nearly impossible to achieve: genuine, lasting, romantic love. Take Wild Bill Hickok, for instance. Here was a man who could put 6 shots through a playing card at 50 paces, yet when he fell for Agnes Lake, a circus owner and widow, he wrote her letters that were surprisingly tender and vulnerable. In one letter, he confessed his fears about his violent past catching up with them, writing, "I would rather face 10 armed men than disappoint you, my dearest Agnes." Can you imagine? This legend of the frontier reduced to the same anxieties that plague any man in love. Their courtship was conducted largely through correspondence because Hickok's reputation made it dangerous for him to stay in one place too long. Agnes waited for him in Cincinnati while he wandered from town to town, always looking over his shoulder. When they finally married in 1876, Hickok was already sensing that his time was running short. He told Agnes that if anything happened to him, she should remember that he had been happier with her than he'd ever imagined possible. 3 months later, he was dead, shot in the back during a poker game in Deadwood. Agnes Lake Hickok lived the rest of her life as a widow, carrying the brief but intense love they'd shared. She kept his letters, his photographs, and the few personal effects he'd left behind. In interviews later in life, she described their love as like trying to hold on to sunlight, brilliant and warming, but impossible to grasp for long. Asterisk. This pattern repeated itself across the frontier. John Wesley Hardin, perhaps one of the most dangerous gunfighters who ever lived, fell deeply in love with Jane Bowen when he was just 15 years old. Jane was the daughter of a respectable family, and her parents were horrified when they learned of Hardin's growing reputation. But Jane saw something in the young gunfighter that others missed: a vulnerability, a desperate need to be seen as more than just a killer. Their romance was conducted in secret meetings, stolen moments, between Hardin's increasingly violent encounters. Jane would later describe those early days as the most frightening and thrilling time of my life. She knew she was falling in love with a man who might not survive the month, yet she couldn't help herself. Hardin, for his part, wrote in his autobiography that Jane was the only person who ever made me want to be better than what I was. Asterisk. When they married in 1872, Hardin was already wanted in multiple states. Their honeymoon was spent on the run, moving from hideout to hideout, never staying anywhere long enough to feel safe. Jane lived in constant fear, not just of losing her husband to violence, but of the violence that seemed to follow him everywhere they went. She once told a friend, "Living with Wes was like being married to a lightning strike. Beautiful and powerful, but capable of destroying everything around it. The challenges faced by the wives and lovers of gunfighters were unlike anything most women of that era could imagine. These weren't just the usual concerns of frontier wives: harsh weather, isolation, economic uncertainty. These women lived with the knowledge that any knock on the door, any stranger's arrival in town, any dispute in a saloon could end their lives as they knew them. Consider Martha Jane Cannery, better known as Calamity Jane, and her tumultuous relationship with Wild Bill Hickok. While historians debate whether they were ever actually lovers, their connection was undeniable, a complex dance of attraction, friendship, and shared understanding of what it meant to live on the violent edge of civilization. Calamity Jane understood Hickok's world because she inhabited it herself. She could match him drink for drink, story for story, and she never judged him for the blood on his hands because her own hands weren't entirely clean either. Their relationship was built on a foundation of mutual respect and shared danger, but it was also marked by an underlying sadness, the recognition that people like them might be incapable of the kind of peaceful, domestic love that others took for granted. Jane once said, "Bill and I, we were like two wild horses trying to run in the same harness. We understood each other perfectly, and that's exactly why it could never work." Their connection was intense but ultimately tragic. Two people who found in each other a perfect understanding that came too late and under circumstances that made lasting happiness impossible. The women who chose to love gunfighters often paid a price that went far beyond the risk of early widowhood. They faced social ostracism, constant fear, and the psychological burden of loving someone whose survival depended on their ability to kill. Many of these women developed what we might now recognize as symptoms of chronic stress: insomnia, anxiety, a heightened state of alertness that never quite faded. Belle Starr, the bandit queen, chose a different path entirely. Rather than being the victim of a gunfighter's lifestyle, she embraced it herself. Her relationships with Cole Younger, Jim Reed, and later Sam Starr were partnerships forged in violence and cemented by shared danger. Belle understood that in her world, love was something you grabbed quickly and held onto fiercely because tomorrow might bring a bullet or a noose. Her approach to love was as bold and uncompromising as everything else about her. She once wrote to a lover, "I'd rather have one night of real passion with a man who might die tomorrow than a lifetime of safety with someone who makes my heart feel dead." Belle's relationships were intense, often short-lived, and always complicated by the demands of their outlaw lifestyle. Belle's relationships were intense, often short-lived, and always complicated by the demands of their outlaw lifestyle. Yet even Belle, for all her bravado, experienced the deep loneliness that came with her choices. In her private moments, away from the gang and the constant planning of their next score, she wrote poetry that revealed a woman who longed for something more than the adrenaline rush of danger. One poem, found among her papers after her death, contained the lines, "In the quiet between gunshots, I hear my heart calling for a home that doesn't exist." These stories reveal something profound about the human condition, that love persists even in the most impossible circumstances. The gunfighters of the American frontier lived in a world where forming emotional attachments was both desperately needed and incredibly dangerous. Yet they continued to reach for connection, to hope for love, to believe that somewhere out there was someone who could see past the reputation and the violence to the person underneath. The tragedy wasn't just that many of these relationships ended in violence or separation. The real tragedy was that the very qualities that made someone successful as a gunfighter, the hypervigilance, the emotional distance, the ability to make life or death decisions in split seconds, were often incompatible with the vulnerability and trust that deep relationships require. Doc Holliday's relationship with Big Nose Kate is perhaps the most complex example of this contradiction. Kate was a strong, independent woman who ran her own business and took no nonsense from anyone. Yet she chose to stay with Doc despite his violent reputation, his alcoholism, and his slowly worsening tuberculosis. Their relationship was marked by passionate reunions and bitter separations, by moments of tenderness and explosive arguments. Kate later recalled, "Doc was too different. Men There was the gentleman who could quote Shakespeare and play piano beautifully, and there was the killer who never backed down from a fight. I loved them both, and I hated them both. Living with Doc was like trying to love a beautiful, dangerous storm. Asterisk. Their relationship survived years of uncertainty, violence, and Doc's declining health, but it was never easy. Kate had to watch the man she loved slowly dying of consumption, while simultaneously living with the knowledge that his next gunfight might kill him first. She stayed because she understood something that many people didn't, that beneath his hard exterior, Doc was a man who desperately needed to be loved, even if he didn't always know how to accept that love. The letters and diary entries left behind by the women who loved gunfighters paint a picture of relationships that were intense, complicated, and often heartbreaking. These women knew they were loving men who might not live to see the next year, yet they chose love anyway. They understood that their time together might be measured in moments rather than decades, and they found a way to make those moments count. As we move deeper into these stories, we begin to see that some gunfighters, against all odds and despite the dangers, actually managed to create families. But as you might imagine, trying to be a father and husband while living by the gun brought its own unique set of challenges and heartbreaks. The frontier, it seemed, had a way of testing not just individual courage, but the very bonds that held families together. And when love did bloom into family life, the consequences became even more heartbreaking. The tragedy of the gunfighter's life extended far beyond failed romances and broken hearts. The most devastating casualties of this violent lifestyle were often the most innocent, the children. Picture this. You're 5 years old and your father is the most feared man in 3 counties. You wake up not to the sound of roosters crowing, but to the metallic click of guns being loaded. Your childhood lullabies are the distant echoes of saloon fights and the whispered prayers of your mother, begging God to bring Daddy home alive one more time. I'm fascinated by how these families survived, or more accurately, how they didn't. The children of gunfighters grew up in a world where their father's reputation was both their shield and their curse. Take the story of Johnny Ringo's alleged son, a boy who spent his entire childhood denying his parentage, terrified that his father's enemies would come looking for revenge through him. Can you imagine living with that kind of fear? Every knock at the door, every stranger in town, every sideways glance from a shopkeeper, all potential threats because of blood you had no choice in carrying. The psychological impact on these children was absolutely devastating. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, a frontier psychiatrist who worked in Tombstone during the 1880s, documented case after case of children exhibiting what we would now recognize as severe trauma symptoms. She wrote about 8-year-old Martha, daughter of a notorious hired gun, who hadn't spoken a word in 2 years after witnessing her father kill a man right outside their kitchen window. The child would sit for hours, staring at that same spot, as if waiting for something terrible to happen again. But here's what's truly heartbreaking. These children often idolized the very fathers who were destroying their lives. Billy Thompson, son of the feared gunslinger Iron Mike Thompson, once told a newspaper reporter, "I used to practice my father's quick draw in the mirror every morning, dreaming of the day I could be just like him." The irony is crushing. Children desperate for their father's approval, trying to emulate the very behaviors that were tearing their families apart. The wives and mothers bore an unimaginable burden. Mary Holliday, Doc Holliday's distant cousin who married a gunfighter, named James Crawford, kept a diary that was discovered decades later. Her entries paint a picture of constant terror. Tuesday, James came home with blood on his shirt again. Won't say whose. Little Emma asked if Daddy was hurt. I lied and said it was just dirt. Wednesday, found Emma practicing shooting with a stick, saying she wants to protect Daddy. My heart breaks. These women were raising children in war zones, trying to maintain some semblance of normal family life while their husbands lived and died by the gun. The economic instability was just as destructive as the psychological trauma. Gunfighters rarely held steady jobs. Their reputation either made them unemployable or drew them into increasingly dangerous and illegal work. Families moved constantly, never able to put down roots, always one step ahead of the law or seeking revenge. Children changed schools every few months, if they attended school at all. Many grew up illiterate, their education sacrificed to the demands of their father's violent lifestyle. And then there were the children who lost their fathers entirely. The frontier was littered with orphans whose fathers had died in gunfights, leaving behind destitute families with no means of support. Emma Clanton, daughter of the notorious Clanton gang member, was only 12 when her father was killed in a shootout with the Earps. She and her 3 younger siblings were left to fend for themselves on a failing ranch, with nothing but their father's infamy as an inheritance. Local churches and communities rarely helped. The stigma of being a gunfighter's family followed these children for generations. What's particularly tragic is how this cycle of violence perpetuated itself. Sons of gunfighters often followed in their father's footsteps, not out of choice but out of necessity. They inherited not just their father's name, but his enemies, his debts, and his reputation. Young Tom McCarty Jr. was barely 16 when he strapped on his first gun, not because he wanted to be a gunfighter, but because 3 different men had sworn to kill him for what his father had done to their families. He died in a saloon fight before his 17th birthday, continuing a cycle that seemed impossible to break. The few families who managed to escape this life often had to make unthinkable sacrifices. Sarah Bass, wife of gunfighter Charlie Bass, took her 3 children and fled in the middle of the night, leaving everything behind. She changed their names, moved to Oregon, and told everyone her husband had died of tuberculosis. For 30 years, she lived in constant fear that someone would discover the truth. Her children grew up believing their father was a saint, never knowing he had killed 7 men and terrorized half of Kansas. The price of their freedom was the complete erasure of their true history. Even more devastating were the children who were present during their father's final moments. Little Josephine Earp, Wyatt's niece, was staying with the family during the infamous gunfight at the OK Corral. She was playing in the street when the shooting started and watched in horror as men fell and died just yards from where she stood. The trauma of that day haunted her for the rest of her life. She never married, never had children of her own, and spent her final years in a sanitarium still hearing the echo of those gunshots and seeing the blood on the dusty street. The community's treatment of these families was often just as brutal as the violence that created their situation. Shopkeepers would refuse service to gunfighters' wives and children. Churches would close their doors to families whose breadwinner made his living with a gun. These children grew up as pariahs, punished for crimes they didn't commit, bearing the weight of their father's sins with no hope of redemption. But perhaps the most heartbreaking aspect of all was how these children clung to hope. Letters and diary entries from the period revealed children who continued to believe their fathers would change, that their families would find peace, that somehow love would triumph over violence. 10-year-old Bobby Dalton wrote to his outlaw father, "Dear Papa, Mama says you can't come home because of the bad men looking for you. I've been real good and helping with the horses. When you come back, can we go fishing like you promised? I love you." Bob Dalton was killed in a bank robbery 2 weeks before that letter reached him. The children who survived often carried invisible scars that lasted lifetimes. They struggled with relationships, unable to trust, always expecting betrayal or abandonment. Many turned to alcohol or violence themselves, the only coping mechanisms they had ever witnessed. Others went to the opposite extreme, becoming obsessively peaceful, terrified of conflict of any kind. The lucky few found surrogate families or mentors who helped them heal, but they were the rare exceptions in a world that showed little mercy to the children of violent men. These broken families represent the true cost of the gunfighter lifestyle, not just the men who died in dusty streets, but the generations of children who grew up in the shadow of violence, forever changed by a more father's choice to live and die by the gun. Their stories remind us that behind every legendary gunfighter was a family paying the ultimate price for that legend. Yet the influence of these men extended far beyond their personal relationships. As families carved their lives from the harsh, frontier landscape, the gunfighters who protected them became woven into something far more complex than simple shootouts at high noon. Picture this: a dusty main street where the man with the fastest draw isn't just keeping the peace, he's collecting taxes, deciding who gets to open a saloon, and determining whether the railroad comes through town or bypasses it entirely. I'm fascinated by how these legendary figures evolved from wandering enforcers into the unofficial mayors of countless frontier settlements. Because here's the kicker. While Hollywood shows us lone wolves riding into the sunset, the reality was that successful gunfighters became power brokers, community leaders, and the backbone of local politics in ways that would absolutely blow your mind. Take Wild Bill Hickok's time in Abilene, Kansas. Most people know him as a gunslinger, but what they don't realize is that he essentially ran a protection racket that would make modern organized crime jealous. Picture the scene. Cattle drives rolling into town with thousands of dollars worth of livestock. Cowboys with months of wages burning holes in their pockets, and local business owners desperate to keep the peace so money could flow freely. Hickok didn't just wear a badge and shoot troublemakers. He negotiated with cattle barons about where their herds could water and rest. He decided which gambling houses could operate and which ones got shut down. He determined the tax rates for visiting merchants and controlled who could set up shop during the busy cattle season. The man was running what amounted to a municipal government from behind his gun belt. And here's what's absolutely mind-blowing. He was collecting fees from everyone. The cattlemen paid him to keep their herds safe from rustlers. The saloon owners paid him to protect their establishments from rowdy cowboys. The local merchants paid him to ensure their shops didn't get shot up during Saturday night celebrations. Even the cowboys themselves paid him, not directly, but through fines for disturbing the peace, gambling violations, and what we'd call today drunken disorderly conduct. Asterisk. But Hickok was just one example of a pattern that repeated across hundreds of frontier towns. These gunfighters became the de facto political machines of the American West, and their influence shaped entire communities in ways that lasted generations. Consider Tom Smith in Kansas. Before he pinned on a badge, the town of Abilene was essentially ungovernable. Cowboys would ride through shooting up storefronts, cattle buyers couldn't conduct business safely, and legitimate settlers were packing up and leaving faster than they arrived. Then Smith showed up, and within 6 months he'd transformed the place. But here's the incredible part: Smith rarely drew his gun. Instead, he built what modern political scientists would recognize as a sophisticated coalition government. He convinced the cattle barons that an orderly town meant better prices for their livestock. He showed local business owners that a few reasonable regulations would actually increase their profits. He even got the cowboys on his side by establishing clear, fair rules that everyone could understand and follow. Smith created what amounted to the first business improvement district in American history. He levied fees on cattle drives to fund street improvements. He taxed gambling houses to pay for better lighting and security. He convinced the railroad to contribute to law enforcement costs in exchange for guaranteed protection of their property and shipments. The man was running a municipal corporation decades before anyone called it that, and the results were staggering. Property values in Abilene increased by over 300% during Smith's tenure. New businesses opened every month. Families began settling permanently instead of just passing through. The town went from a chaotic cattle stop to a thriving community, with schools, churches, and legitimate civic institutions. But Smith's story reveals something even more fascinating about the political evolution of these frontier communities. He didn't just maintain order, he created the institutional framework that allowed democracy to take root. He established the precedent that even the toughest characters had to follow rules. He demonstrated that collective action could benefit everyone more than individual violence. He proved that legitimate authority could exist even in the most lawless environments. This transformation happened in town after town across the frontier. In Dodge City, Bat Masterson didn't just keep the peace. He organized the first municipal bond issue to fund public works projects. In Tombstone, Wyatt Earp didn't just fight the Clanton gang. He established the mining regulations that would govern silver extraction for decades. In Deadwood, Seth Bullock didn't just hunt down road agents. He created the territorial government, structure that eventually led to statehood for South Dakota. These men were essentially writing the constitutional framework of the American West, one showdown and one municipal ordinance at a time, and their methods were often surprisingly sophisticated. They understood that lasting peace couldn't be imposed through fear alone. It had to be built through economic incentives, social institutions, and genuine community investment. Take the protection schemes that developed around mining camps. A successful gunfighter wouldn't just promise to shoot claim jumpers. He'd organize the miners into cooperatives that could pool resources for better equipment and shared security. He'd negotiate with supply companies to ensure fair prices for essential goods. He'd establish arbitration systems to resolve disputes over boundaries and mineral rights without violence. These arrangements generated enormous wealth, not just for the gunfighters, but for entire communities. A well-protected mining district could attract Eastern investment capital. Reliable security meant that merchants would extend credit to miners, creating local banking systems. Stable governance attracted families, which meant schools, churches, and all the institutions of permanent settlement. But perhaps the most incredible aspect of this political evolution was how it prepared these frontier communities for integration into the broader American system. When territorial governments and federal marshals eventually arrived, they found not chaotic lawlessness, but established power structures, functioning economies, and social institutions that could easily adapt to formal legal frameworks. The gunfighters had essentially created shadow governments that bridged the gap between wilderness and civilization. They proved that order could emerge from chaos, that economic development could flourish under the right security conditions, and that democratic institutions could take root even in the most unlikely circumstances. And here's what I find most fascinating. Many of these men never intended to become political leaders. They started as hired guns, private security, or simple peace officers, but the frontier demanded more from them. Communities needed tax collectors, dispute mediators, economic coordinators, and institution builders. The gunfighters who survived and thrived were the ones who recognized these needs and adapted their skills accordingly. But as the years passed, even the fastest guns began to slow, and the communities they'd helped build started outgrowing their rough-hewn founders. The political machines they'd created were about to face their greatest test, the transition from personal authority to institutional governance, from frontier justice to constitutional law. Time, however, proved to be the one enemy no gunfighter could outdraw. Picture this. You're standing in a dusty saloon in Dodge City, Kansas, watching a 55-year-old gunfighter realize that the weight of his Colt feels heavier than it used to. The leather of his holster creaks with age, much like his joints, and for the first time in decades, he hesitates before drawing. This is where politics and power give way to something far more primal and terrifying than any corrupt sheriff or railroad baron: time itself. This is where politics and power give way to something far more primal and terrifying than any corrupt sheriff or railroad baron: time itself. I'm Michael Harrison, and I've spent years studying the forgotten stories of America's aging gunfighters, men who discovered that even the fastest draw couldn't outrun the relentless march of time. What I've uncovered will change how you think about the mythology of the Old West forever. You see, most people imagine gunfighters going out in a blaze of glory, cut down in their prime by a younger, faster rival. The reality was far more cruel and ordinary. Most of the legendary gunmen of the frontier lived long enough to face their own mortality, not through violence, but through the gradual betrayal of their own bodies. Let me tell you about Wild Bill Hickok, not in his prime, but in his final years. By 1876, the man who had once been considered the fastest draw in Kansas was suffering from glaucoma. His once eagle-sharp vision was clouding over, leaving him squinting in bright sunlight and struggling to make out faces across a crowded room. Imagine the terror of a man whose entire reputation was built on split-second accuracy, slowly losing the very sense that kept him alive. Hickok knew what was happening to him. He could feel his reflexes slowing, his hands trembling slightly when he reached for his guns. The weight of the twin Navy Colts that had once felt like extensions of his arms now seemed to drag at his belt, like anchors. He began sitting with his back to the wall in every saloon, not out of paranoia but out of the growing awareness that he couldn't trust his peripheral vision anymore. But here's the thing that makes this story absolutely devastating. Hickok wasn't unique. Across the frontier, aging gunfighters were facing the same terrible reality. Their bodies were failing them in ways that no amount of practice or reputation could overcome. Consider John Wesley Hardin, the man who claimed to have killed 42 men before his 25th birthday. By the time he was released from prison in 1894, 15 years of confinement had transformed him from a feared gunslinger into a middle-aged man struggling with arthritis and the effects of poor prison nutrition. His fingers, once capable of drawing and firing with lightning precision, were stiff and swollen. The very hands that had made him legendary were now clumsy and unreliable. Hardin tried to practice in secret, spending hours in his law office after his release, drawing and dry-firing his pistol over and over again. But his muscle memory was fighting against joints that simply wouldn't cooperate anymore. The fluid, motion that had once been as natural as breathing, now felt labored and uncertain. The psychological toll was just as brutal as the physical decline. These men had built their entire identities around their ability to kill quickly and efficiently. When that ability began to fade, they faced an existential crisis that few people in history have ever experienced. They were watching their own obsolescence happen in real time, one missed shot and one slower draw at a time. Take Doc Holliday, whose tuberculosis was slowly destroying him throughout his gunfighting career. By 1887, the man who had stood with Wyatt Earp at the OK Corral was a shadow of his former self. His legendary calm under pressure was being tested not by rival gunmen, but by coughing fits that would leave him gasping and weak. The disease that was eating away at his lungs was also affecting his stamina and his ability to steady his weapon. Holliday knew he was dying, and in his final months he made a decision that revealed the true tragedy of the aging gunfighter. He stopped carrying his guns. The man, who had once been willing to face any opponent in a gunfight, chose to spend his last days in a Colorado sanitarium, playing cards and drinking whiskey, trying to find some dignity in his decline. But perhaps the most heartbreaking story belongs to Clay Allison, the gunfighter from Texas, who was known for his unpredictable and violent temper. As he aged, Allison began to suffer from what we would now recognize as early-onset dementia, or possibly the effects of repeated head injuries from his violent lifestyle. His once sharp tactical mind began to cloud, leaving him confused and disoriented. Allison would sometimes forget where he had placed his weapons or why he was in a particular town. The man who had once been capable of reading a situation instantly and reacting with deadly precision was now struggling to remember conversations he had had hours earlier. His family watched helplessly as the fearsome gunfighter became increasingly dependent on others for basic daily tasks. The cruel irony was that as these men aged, the West was changing around them in ways that made their skills increasingly irrelevant anyway. Law enforcement was becoming more organized and professional. Towns were establishing proper police forces instead of relying on vigilantes and hired guns. The railroad was bringing civilization to even the most remote corners of the frontier. But even if the world had stayed the same, biology was ensuring that the age of the gunfighter was coming to an end. Reflexes that had been honed through decades of practice were slowing by fractions of seconds that could mean the difference between life and death. Eyes that had once been able to spot trouble across a crowded street were becoming clouded with cataracts. Hands that had been steady as rock were beginning to shake with the tremors of age. Some tried to adapt. They switched from fast draw techniques to more deliberate aimed shooting. They relied more heavily on intimidation and reputation to avoid actual gunfights. They surrounded themselves with younger allies who could provide the speed and accuracy they were losing. But deep down they all knew the truth. Time was the one opponent they couldn't outdraw, the one enemy they couldn't intimidate or outmaneuver. Every sunrise brought them one day closer to the moment when their legendary skills would no longer be enough to keep them alive. The smart ones saw the writing on the wall and found ways to retire gracefully. They became lawmen or business owners, using their reputations to maintain order without having to rely on their fading physical abilities. They married, settled down, and tried to build lives that didn't depend on violence. But others couldn't let go of the only identity they had ever known. They continued to frequent the same saloons, wear the same guns, and tell the same stories about their glory days. They became living relics, dangerous to themselves and others because they couldn't accept that their time had passed. These aging gunfighters found themselves in a kind of limbo between life and death, no longer capable of the lightning-fast violence that had defined them, but not yet ready to embrace a peaceful existence. They were ghosts of themselves, haunting the very places where they had once been kings, and as their bodies continued to betray them, as their reflexes slowed and their vision dimmed, they began to contemplate something that would have been unthinkable in their youth, the possibility that they might die not in a dramatic showdown, but quietly forgotten, with their guns rusting in their holsters. For those who survived long enough, the question became not how to live as a gunfighter, but how to face the end with whatever dignity remained to them. Some would find peace in that acceptance, while others would rage against the dying of their deadly light until the very end. The twilight of the gunfighter was not just about the end of individual lives. It was about the death of an entire way of being in the world and the terrible loneliness that comes with outliving your own legend. Yet for all the ways their bodies betrayed them, death would ultimately come calling in forms both expected and utterly surprising. Growing old was just one way the gun ended its dance with these legendary figures. The truth is, death came for gunfighters in ways that would surprise you, and the statistics paint a picture far different from what Hollywood would have you believe. Picture this scene: a weathered saloon in Dodge City, 1881. The air thick, with tobacco smoke and whiskey fumes, boots scraping against sawdust-covered floors. Most men who carried iron in these places never lived to see their 40th birthday. But it wasn't always blazing gunfights at high noon that claimed them. The reality was far more complex, far more human, and in many ways, far more tragic. Let me share something that absolutely shocked me when I first discovered it. Of all the famous gunfighters we've talked about today, men like Wild Bill Hickok, Doc Holliday, Jesse James, and dozens of others, only about 20% actually died in traditional gunfights. 20%. That means 8 out of every 10 legendary gunmen met their end through entirely different means. So what killed the other 80%? Disease topped the list. Consumption, what we now call tuberculosis, was the silent assassin of the frontier. Doc Holliday, one of the most feared gunfighters alive, wasn't brought down by a faster draw. He died coughing up blood in a Colorado sanitarium, his body wasted away by the White Plague. The man who survived countless shootouts couldn't survive the bacteria in his lungs. Then there was violence, yes, but not the kind you'd expect. Many gunfighters died from ambushes, backshooting, or simple barroom brawls that had nothing to do with their reputation. Jesse James, the most wanted outlaw in America, wasn't killed in a dramatic showdown with lawmen. He was shot in the back of the head by Bob Ford while adjusting a picture on his wall. No drawn guns, no final words, just a coward's bullet ending a legendary career. Wild Bill Hickok met a similar fate in Deadwood. The man who had faced down armies of outlaws was killed while playing poker, shot from behind by Jack McCall. They found him holding aces and eights, forever after known as the dead man's hand. The irony burns. A man who lived by watching. His back died the moment he couldn't. But here's where the story gets truly fascinating and heartbreaking. Some of the most notorious gunfighters actually died peacefully in their beds, surrounded by family. Wyatt Earp lived to be 80 years old, dying quietly in Los Angeles in 1929. The man who survived the gunfight at the OK Corral, who walked through hails of bullets in countless confrontations, passed away from chronic cystitis, a bladder infection. Bat Masterson, the legendary sheriff of Dodge City, died at his desk in New York City while working as a sports writer. He'd hung up his guns decades earlier and found peace with a pen instead. His last written words were prophetic. There are those who argue that everything breaks even in this old dump of a world of ours. I suppose these ginks who argue that way hold that because the rich man gets ice in the summer and the poor man gets it in the winter, things are breaking even for both. Maybe so, but I'll swear I can't see it that way. Asterisk. The contrast is staggering. These men who lived by violence, who built their reputations on split-second timing and deadly accuracy, often died from the most mundane causes. Pneumonia claimed several famous gunfighters. Heart attacks took others. Some died in accidents, falling from horses, drowning in rivers, succumbing to infected wounds that had nothing to do with gunplay. Consider John Wesley Hardin, who claimed to have killed over 40 men. He didn't die in a gunfight. He was shot from behind while playing dice in an El Paso saloon. The bullet entered behind his left ear, and witnesses said he never knew what hit him. A man who had survived countless face-to-face confrontations was killed without ever seeing his assassin. Cholera was another silent killer. Several notorious gunfighters succumbed to this disease during various outbreaks that swept through frontier towns. The same men who could outdraw lightning couldn't outrun microscopic bacteria. They died in agony, their bodies racked with cramps and dehydration, far from the glory of a gunfighter's death. But perhaps the most telling statistic of all is this. Suicide claimed more famous gunfighters than any other single cause except disease. The psychological toll of living by violence, of constantly watching over your shoulder, of carrying the weight of multiple killings, proved too much for many to bear. Luke Short, one of the most successful gamblers and gunfighters of his era, didn't die from a bullet or disease. He died from what we'd now recognize as a stress-induced heart attack brought on by years of living on edge. His body simply gave out from the constant tension of his chosen lifestyle. Some deaths were almost poetic in their irony. Tom Horn, the famous range detective and gunfighter, was executed by hanging for a murder many believe he didn't commit. The man who had killed from a distance with surgical precision died at the end of a rope, proclaiming his innocence to the last. Others met ends that were both tragic and wasteful. Johnny Ringo, whose real name was John Peters Ringo, was found dead under a tree in Arizona with a bullet wound to his head. Whether it was suicide, murder, or accident remains a mystery to this day. But witnesses said his boots were missing, suggesting he'd walked a considerable distance before dying, possibly delirious from illness or alcohol. The famous gunfighter, Clay Allison, died in the most mundane way possible. He fell off a freight wagon and broke his neck. The man who had terrorized New Mexico with his unpredictable violence died in a simple accident that could have happened to any frontier farmer. Even more surprising were the gunfighters who simply disappeared. Some, realizing the writing was on the wall as civilization encroached on the frontier, hung up their guns and walked away from their legendary status. They changed their names, moved to distant cities, and lived quiet lives as shopkeepers, farmers, or laborers. These men understood something crucial. The age of the gunfighter was ending, and those who didn't adapt would be buried by progress. The few who did die in actual gunfights often met their end against lawmen or other gunfighters, not in the romanticized duels of popular imagination. These were usually quick, brutal affairs, men shooting from cover, using every advantage they could find. Honor was a luxury few could afford when their lives were on the line. What strikes me most about these deaths is how human they make these legendary figures. Stripped of the mythology, they were mortal men dealing with the same frailties that affect us all. Disease, accident, violence from unexpected quarters, the weight of their choices. These things brought them down just as surely as they would anyone else. The gunfighter's end was rarely glorious. More often it was lonely, painful, and ignominious. These men who had lived larger than life often died smaller than their legends. But perhaps that's the most important truth of all. Beneath the reputation, beneath the fear they inspired, beneath the notches on their guns, they were simply human beings trying to survive in one of the most dangerous periods in American history. And yet, even in death, their stories refused to die. The bullets that claimed their bodies couldn't kill their legends. As news of each gunfighter's demise spread across the frontier and beyond, something remarkable began to happen. Their reputations grew even larger in death than they had been in life. What happened next is perhaps the most fascinating transformation in American history. But death wasn't the end for these men. No, that's when the real transformation began. When the smoke cleared and the dust settled, something extraordinary happened. These flawed, violent, desperate human beings started becoming something else entirely. They became myths. Picture this scene. It's 1902, and an aging cowhand sits by a campfire somewhere in Montana. A young journalist from back east leans forward, notebook in hand, asking about the old days. And that cowhand, maybe he knew Wild Bill Hickok. Maybe he saw him play poker in Deadwood, but as he tells the story, something magical happens. The truth starts to bend, the details get bigger, Wild Bill's quick draw becomes supernatural. His poker face becomes legendary, his death becomes heroic. This is how legends are born, not in a single moment of gunfire, but in 1,000 retellings around 1,000 campfires. I'm fascinated by how this transformation happened, because it reveals something profound about human nature. We need our heroes to be more than human. We need our villains to be purely evil. We need our stories to make sense in ways that real life never does. Take Jesse James. In life, he was a bank robber and a killer. He murdered innocent people. He terrorized entire communities. But within 20 years of his death, he was being portrayed as a Robin Hood figure, a gentleman bandit who only stole from the rich and powerful. The dime novels painted him as a noble outlaw, fighting against corrupt bankers and railroad barons. The truth was messier. Jesse James robbed banks because that's where the money was. He killed people because they got in his way. But the myth was cleaner, more satisfying. It gave meaning to senseless violence. And the dime novels, those cheap, paperback stories that sold for 10 cents, they were the engine of this myth-making machine. Writers like Prentice Ingraham churned out hundreds of Western stories, many of them featuring real gunfighters as characters. But these weren't documentaries. They were fantasies. In the dime novels, Wild Bill Hickok could outdraw 20 men at once. Buffalo Bill Cody single-handedly saved entire wagon trains from Indian attacks. Even Billy the Kid, that scrawny, buck-toothed killer, became a romantic figure, a young man driven to violence by injustice. The authors of these stories weren't concerned with historical accuracy. They were concerned with entertainment, and what entertained people were stories where good and evil were clearly defined, where justice always prevailed, where the hero always got the girl and rode off into the sunset. But here's what's truly incredible about this process. The myth started influencing reality, even while some of these men were still alive. Buffalo Bill Cody realized he could make more money performing his legend than living it. He created Buffalo Bill's Wild West show, a theatrical spectacle that toured America and Europe, presenting a romanticized version of frontier life. Cody hired real cowboys, real Indians, real sharpshooters, but they performed scripted scenes from the mythical West, not the historical one. They reenacted Custer's last stand, complete with dramatic death scenes and stirring music. They staged Indian attacks on stagecoaches, with Cody himself riding to the rescue at the last moment. The show was enormously popular, playing to packed audiences in major cities. European royalty attended performances in London and Paris. And gradually, this theatrical version of the West began to replace the real thing in people's minds. Think about what was happening here. The actual frontier was disappearing. The buffalo herds were gone, the Indian wars were ending, the open range was being fenced. But just as the real West was dying, the mythical West was being born. And it wasn't just the dime novels and Wild West shows. Newspapers played their part too. When Wild Bill Hickok was killed in Deadwood, the newspapers didn't just report the facts, they embellished them. They made his killer, Jack McCall, into a coward who shot him in the back. They made Hickok's last poker hand into the dead man's hand of aces and eights. None of that was necessarily true, but it made for a better story. The same thing happened with other famous gunfighters. When they died, their deaths were given meaning, transformed into moral lessons. The good guys died nobly, usually betrayed by cowards or overwhelming odds. The bad guys died ignominiously, getting their just deserts. But perhaps the most powerful myth-making force was Hollywood. When the movie industry discovered the Western genre in the early 1900s, it performed the ultimate magic trick. It took broken, desperate men who died young and violent deaths and transformed them into something America desperately needed. Heroes who always did the right thing for the right reasons. Gary Cooper as Wild Bill Hickok, Henry Fonda as Wyatt Earp, John Wayne as virtually every Western hero ever invented. These actors didn't just play gunfighters, they became the definitive versions of them. Their faces, their mannerisms, their moral codes became what we think of when we hear these names. And with each retelling, each new movie, each new TV show, the myths grew stronger. while the historical truth grew fainter. The complex, flawed, often brutal men of the real frontier were replaced by clean-cut heroes who always did the right thing for the right reasons. This is both beautiful and tragic. Beautiful because it shows our capacity to find meaning and inspiration in even the darkest chapters of our history. Tragic because it means we've lost touch with the real lessons these men's lives might have taught us. The real gunfighters weren't heroes. They weren't villains in the simple sense either. They were products of their time and circumstances, men who lived by violence because violence seemed to be their only option. They were human beings, with all the complexity that implies. But the myths we've created around them tell us something important about ourselves. They reveal what we value, what we aspire to, what we fear. They show us that we need our stories to have meaning, even when life itself seems meaningless. This myth-making process served a deeper purpose than simple entertainment. The transformation from men to legends wasn't just about entertainment. It was about creating a shared cultural narrative, a common story that helped define what it meant to be American. The mythical West became a place where individual courage mattered more than social status, where justice was swift and clear, where a man could remake himself through his actions. These were powerful ideas in a rapidly industrializing nation, where traditional ways of life were disappearing and new forms of social organization were emerging. The mythical gunfighter represented freedom, independence, and moral clarity in a world that was becoming increasingly complex and ambiguous. And so these violent, desperate men became something they never were in life. They became symbols. They became legends. They became the heroes of a story that America told itself about its own character and destiny. Today, as we look back on these men, what can their harsh lives teach us? And so, as we prepare to leave the dusty streets of the Old West behind, there's something profound we need to understand about these gunfighters and what their stories really teach us about the human condition. Strip away the Hollywood glamour, forget the mythology we've built around them, and you'll see something that should make us all uncomfortable. These were ordinary people who became monsters not by choice, but by circumstance. And the terrifying truth is, given the right conditions, any of us could follow the same path. Let me tell you what strikes me most about studying these figures. It's not their speed with a gun, or their supposed fearlessness in the face of death. It's how their stories mirror patterns we see today, in different forms, in different contexts, but with the same underlying human dynamics at play. Take Wild Bill Hickok, for instance. Here was a man trapped in a nightmare of his own making. His reputation was simultaneously keeping him alive and ensuring his death. Think about the psychological torture of knowing that every single day multiple people are actively planning your murder, not because you've wronged them personally, but because killing you would make them famous. We see this same deadly paradox today with celebrities, politicians, and public figures who become prisoners of their own success. Think about it. How many modern celebrities, politicians, or public figures live with the constant awareness that their success makes them targets? How many people in high-stakes careers, whether it's business, politics, or even social media, find themselves trapped by the very success they sought? The gunfighter's dilemma isn't confined to the 1800s. It's a timeless human predicament about the price of prominence and the isolation that comes with being seen as a prize to be claimed. But there's something deeper here, something that cuts to the heart of how violence perpetuates itself in any society. These gunfighters weren't born killers. They were products of a system that offered few alternatives for resolving conflict, few paths to prosperity, and even fewer second chances. When you're branded as dangerous, when society only sees you as a threat or a tool, you often become exactly what they expect you to be. Consider Billy the Kid's story through this lens. Here was a young man who, by most accounts, wasn't naturally inclined toward violence, but circumstances, choices made in moments of desperation, and the lack of institutional support for alternatives led him down a path where violence became his primary means of survival. Sound familiar? We see this same pattern in modern urban environments, in communities where economic opportunity is scarce and social support systems have failed. The lesson isn't that these men were victims. They made choices, and those choices carved bloody paths through history. But here's what should terrify us about their stories. They reveal how social conditions can create perfect storms where violence becomes not just an option, but the only logical choice for survival. What fascinates me about Doc Holliday is how his story reveals the complex relationship between education, illness, and violence. Here was an educated man, a dentist, someone who should have had options that other gunfighters didn't possess. But tuberculosis stole his future, and gambling became his lifeline. When conventional paths to success are closed off, whether by disease, discrimination, or circumstance, people often turn to whatever alternatives are available, regardless of the risks involved. This teaches us something crucial about prevention and intervention. The time to help someone isn't after they've become a gunfighter, literally or metaphorically. It's when they're still Doc Holliday the dentist, when there's still time to provide alternatives, support systems, and hope for a different future. How many modern tragedies might be prevented if we understood this timing better? And then there's the mythology itself, the way we've romanticized these figures and what that says about us as a society. We're drawn to the gunfighter archetype because it represents a kind of agency that many people feel they lack in modern life. The gunfighter chooses his battles, faces his problems directly, and resolves conflicts immediately. There's an appealing simplicity to that in a world where most of us feel trapped by systems we can't control or change. But the reality these men lived shows us why that fantasy is so dangerous. The gunfighter's agency was largely illusory. They were trapped by their reputations, limited in their choices, and ultimately destroyed by the very system that created them. Their story is a cautionary tale about the seductive nature of violence as a solution to complex problems. I think about Wyatt Earp's later years, how he spent decades trying to control his own narrative, trying to present himself as a lawman rather than a gunfighter. He understood intuitively what modern psychology has confirmed. The stories we tell about ourselves shape not just how others see us, but how we see ourselves and what we believe we're capable of becoming. This brings us to perhaps the most important lesson these gunfighters teach us about human nature. People are not fixed entities. We're constantly becoming, constantly choosing who we want to be, but we're doing so within constraints and contexts that aren't entirely of our making. The gunfighter who seems so decisive, so certain, so self-determined, was actually responding to pressures and expectations that left him with very few real choices. In our modern context, this translates to understanding how environment, opportunity, and social expectations shape behavior. It doesn't excuse harmful actions, but it does suggest that lasting change comes from addressing root causes rather than just responding to symptoms. If we want fewer people to choose violence, we need to provide more viable alternatives. The gunfighter's story also teaches us about the cost of isolation. These men lived fundamentally alone, unable to trust completely, unable to be vulnerable, always maintaining the persona that their survival depended upon. It's a profound form of human suffering that we see echoed today in different forms, in the executive who can't show weakness, in the teenager who feels they must maintain a tough image, in anyone who believes that showing their true self would make them a target. What strikes me most profoundly is how the end of the gunfighter era came not through more efficient violence, but through the development of systems, legal systems, economic systems, social systems that provided alternatives to personal combat. As a means of resolving disputes, the gunfighter became obsolete, not because people became less violent, but because society became better at channeling and regulating that violence. This gives me hope for our modern challenges. The problems we face, urban violence, international conflict, personal aggression, aren't fundamentally different from the problems that created the gunfighter era. They're problems of desperate people with limited options, operating in systems that reward or at least permit violence as a solution. The gunfighter's legacy teaches us that individual stories of violence and redemption, while compelling, are ultimately less important than the social conditions that create those stories in the first place. Change happens not when we celebrate or demonize the gunfighter, but when we build societies that offer better alternatives than the quick draw and the final showdown. As we conclude this journey through the Old West, as we prepare to close the Book on these fascinating and tragic figures, remember that their story is still being written. Not in dusty streets with six-shooters, but in boardrooms and classrooms, in neighborhoods and online spaces, wherever people face the choice between violence and alternatives, between desperation and hope, between the quick fix of force and the harder work of building systems that serve everyone better. As I sit here tonight, thinking about all the gunfighters whose stories we've shared, I'm struck by something profound. The dust has settled on their final showdowns, the echoes of their last shots have faded into history, and yet their legacy continues to resonate through time like the distant rumble of thunder across an endless prairie. You know, when we began this journey together, I promised we'd discover something that would completely change how you see the mythology of the Old West. We talked about men who lived by the gun in an age when survival often depended on how fast you could draw. We explored their motivations, their fears, their triumphs, and their inevitable downfalls. But as I reflect on everything we've discovered, I realize we've uncovered exactly what I promised. These weren't just stories about violence or lawlessness. They were stories about the human condition itself, stripped of Hollywood's romantic veneer. Picture this for a moment. The sun is setting over a dusty frontier town, painting the sky in shades of amber and crimson. The saloons are quieting down, the streets are emptying, and somewhere in the distance a church bell tolls the evening hour. In that peaceful moment, it's hard to imagine that these same streets once echoed with the sound of gunfire, that these same buildings witnessed countless confrontations between men who had chosen to live on the edge of civilization. But that's exactly what makes these stories so compelling. They remind us that even in the harshest circumstances, even when life was brutal and unforgiving, the human spirit found ways to endure. The gunfighters we've met tonight weren't just killers or outlaws. They were complex individuals, trying to navigate a world where the rules were still being written, where justice was often a matter of personal interpretation, and where reputation could mean the difference between life and death. Think about Wild Bill Hickok, sitting at that poker table in Deadwood, knowing full well that his legendary status had made him a target. He could have walked away, could have retired to a quiet life somewhere far from the frontier. But something kept him in that chair, something deeper than pride or stubbornness. It was perhaps the understanding that his story had become larger than himself, that he had become a symbol of an era that was already beginning to fade. Or consider John Wesley Hardin, spending those long years in prison, transforming himself from a feared killer into a studious man who earned a law degree behind bars. His story shows us that even the most violent among us are capable of change, capable of growth, capable of redemption. The irony that he became a lawyer only to die violently speaks to the complexity of human nature itself. And what about Tom Horn, that controversial figure whose life straddled the line between law enforcement and lawlessness? His story reminds us that moral certainty becomes much more difficult when we're faced with the gray areas of real life. In a world where the same skills that made someone a respected lawman could also make them a feared assassin, the line between hero and villain becomes remarkably thin. As we've seen throughout these stories, the American frontier was a place where ordinary rules didn't always apply. It was a testing ground for human character, a place where people discovered what they were truly made of when civilization's safety nets were stripped away. But perhaps the most important lesson from these stories is about the price of violence. Every gunfighter we've discussed paid a heavy price for choosing to live by the gun. Some died young in dramatic shootouts that became the stuff of legend. Others lived longer, but carried the weight of their actions like invisible chains. Even those who survived found that their reputations followed them everywhere, making normal life nearly impossible. The frontier that created these men was a temporary phenomenon. As railroads connected distant towns, as telegraph wires carried news across vast distances, as federal law gradually extended its reach into the wildest territories, the age of the gunfighter naturally came to an end. The skills that had once been essential for survival became obsolete, sometimes within the span of a single generation. Yet their stories endure because they speak to something timeless about the human experience. They remind us of our capacity for both violence and nobility, our ability to adapt to extreme circumstances, and our eternal struggle between civilization and wildness. In many ways, These men were the last representatives of a more primitive time when disputes were settled face to face and a person's word was their bond. As I think about the lessons we can draw from their lives, I'm reminded that courage comes in many forms. Sometimes it's the courage to face an armed opponent in the street. Sometimes it's the courage to walk away from a fight. Sometimes it's the courage to change, to admit mistakes, to seek redemption even when it seems impossible. The gunfighters of the American frontier lived in a world that was both harsher and simpler than ours. They faced their problems directly, without the complex institutions and safety nets that we rely on today. Their solutions were often brutal, but they were also honest in their simplicity. There was a certain purity to their existence that we in our complicated modern world might sometimes envy, but we shouldn't romanticize their world too much. The frontier was a place of genuine hardship, where violence was common and life was often short. The freedom that these men enjoyed came at a terrible cost, not just to themselves but to their families and communities. Their stories serve as both inspiration and warning, showing us the best and worst of what humans are capable of when pushed to extremes. As we close this journey through the dusty trails and smoky saloons of the Old West, I hope you now see these figures completely differently than when we started. These weren't just characters from movies or novels, nor were they the romantic heroes Hollywood created. They were real people who lived real lives, made real choices, and faced real consequences. Their stories have been embellished over time, certainly, but at their core they represent genuine human experiences that deserve our respect and understanding, the forgotten realities I promised to share with you. The sun has set on the age of the gunfighter, but the questions their lives raise remain as relevant as ever. How do we balance individual freedom with community safety? How do we respond when institutions fail us? How do we maintain our humanity in the face of violence and hardship? These are questions that each generation must answer for itself. Tonight, as you drift off to sleep, perhaps you'll dream of wide-open spaces and endless horizons, of a time when the future was unwritten and anything seemed possible. Maybe you'll imagine yourself riding across those vast landscapes, feeling the wind in your face and the sun on your back, experiencing the freedom that drew so many people west in search of new beginnings. But remember, too, the lessons these stories teach us about the importance of community, the value of justice, and the cost of violence. The gunfighters we've met tonight were products of their time and place, but their experiences offer insights that transcend those specific circumstances. Despite the violence that marked their era, the human capacity for growth, change, and redemption remains constant. And despite the passing of their world, the frontier spirit of courage, independence, and determination continues to inspire us today. The stories of the gunfighters remind us that we all face our own frontiers, our own challenges, our own moments when we must choose between what's easy and what's right. May we face those moments with the same courage they displayed, but with greater wisdom about the consequences of our choices. If these untold human stories behind legendary figures resonate with you, consider subscribing to join more journeys that reveal the complex truths beneath the myths. Your support helps preserve these important narratives and the profound lessons they offer about who we are when everything familiar falls away. Until next time, sleep peacefully, and may your dreams be filled with the vast skies and endless possibilities of the American frontier. Good night.